Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our WeMove Adolescent Health webinar. My name is Izukanji Sikaswe with the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, also known as CIDED. I am chairing this session in Zambia, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. This is the 5th webinar in the WeMove series. These webinars are sponsored by the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation with support from IAVI. And as participants in these webinar series from the beginning, we're truly thankful to the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation and IAVI. We will have 2 talks this afternoon. We have 2 great speakers. Firstly, we will have Dr. Kathleen Sikkema coming in from Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, followed by Dr. Mfiki Mahlangu from the South African Medical Research Council. We also have a phenomenal artist poet, a young lady who will share with us her poem. And to round us off, we'll have a panel discussion from 2 experts in the field. Today, we're looking at gender-based violence. So our 2 panel discussants this afternoon will be Ndumiso Madubela, as well as Ronel Koekemoer. So I'd like us to start this afternoon's session, this afternoon's webinar, by first having a poll. You should see a series of questions, just trying to get a sense of what your thoughts are on gender-based violence and how you think it impacts our society. So we should be having a poll coming up to your screen, and I'll ask you to get ready for it and participate. I'm sorry for the hiccup. I'm not seeing the poll coming up. So if you can just give it a couple of seconds. All right, so I'm being told the poll has come up and is now available. So I'll ask all the participants to please participate in the poll. Unfortunately, I cannot see it on my end, and perhaps that's a delay on my part. But if the poll is up, please go ahead and participate and choose from one of the responses, available responses in the poll. I see that there's some responses coming through. Louise Botman has submitted. I'm just going to try and log in a different way because I'm not seeing the poll coming up on my screen. So we do have some answers coming through, and 66% of people say that all the above responses to the poll questions are correct. And perhaps I can just have Melissa read out the poll question to me, because unfortunately I cannot see the question and I cannot walk us through it.
Sure. Yeah, the question is: gender-based violence is violence that affects only women, girls, and boys, or is always physical and occurs in private. Sexual violence can be targeted at men and boys, and all of the above are correct. And the responses, 13%, 5 out of the 38 that responded selected violence that affects only women, girls, and boys. No one selected is always physical and occurs in private. 18%, 7 out of 38 selected sexual violence can be targeted at men and boys. And 26 out of 38, 68% selected, 27 out of 39 selected all of the above are correct.
All right, thank you for that. And I'm hoping that during this session today, we'll be able to understand some of the intricacies or the trick question with the trick words or buzzwords with the options that were presented. So the options presented had some elements of truth in them, but not all were true. So essentially, I hope that our topic this afternoon will help us understand that gender-based violence can affect men as well as women, boys and girls. So it does not really matter what gender you are, but can happen across both men and women, as well as across diverse ages. And it is true, it's not always just physical. So it can be physical and it can be emotional. I'm sorry, I forget one of the other options that was there. I think it was that gender-based violence can affect men and boys. And I wanted to bring that out because a lot of the time we think that gender-based violence is just directed to women and girls. But it's important that we remember that gender-based violence can affect men and boys. I think with that quick recap, and again, apologies that I was not able to see the questions and walk you through them, we will then move to our first speaker. So like I said in the beginning, we have really well-known experts in this area that have worked for a while in the topic of gender-based violence, particularly in our communities. And to start us off, we will start with Professor Kathleen Sikkema. She has a PhD and is a clinical psychologist who specializes in health and community psychology. She conducts a lot of community-based intervention research focused on HIV prevention and mental health treatment, both in the US and in low and middle income countries. What is interesting and exciting with Dr. Kathleen Sikkema is that she has done quite a lot of work here on the continent, specifically in South Africa for the last 20 years or so. And her research has been focused more around integrating mental health treatment into HIV primary care, particularly for women and girls who have experienced sexual trauma. So we will have Dr. Kathleen Sikkema present. This has been recorded for us, but she's here live with us and will be engaging with us towards the end of this session. So we'll go over and start with Dr. Kathleen Sikkema's presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in your adolescent health webinar series with the focus today on gender-based violence. I'll be talking with you about sexual trauma and HIV and our work to examine whether an intervention that focuses on mental health, stress, and coping can improve care engagement with the goal of achieving viral suppression. We are conducting this clinical trial in collaboration with Dr. John Jaska and our fantastic team at the University of Cape Town. So if our question and our goal is viral suppression, why should we consider mental health interventions to aid in doing so? And why trauma and sexual violence? So first, to think about mental health in general, what studies are needed in those types of interventions, and if they work to achieve viral suppression, we should be looking at why they work, as well as conducting studies that helps inform implementation if found to be effective. A little bit more about why trauma, focusing on trauma when we're looking at HIV clinical outcomes. We know that traumatic stress is often comorbid with other mental disorders and is linked to poor care engagement, specific to HIV as well as other health conditions. That sexual trauma adds to the stress of managing HIV, and in particular interest for our work, how sexual trauma contributes to avoidance and how trauma may result in compromised immune function and increased infectivity. So if we think about stress and violence, it may help explain why women with sexual trauma histories actually progress faster to AIDS and face greater AIDS-related mortality. In this study that looked at a number of, a range of factors that had effects in relation to ART adherence, we actually see that intimate partner violence tops the list in terms of the strongest correlation to ART adherence. Another look at intimate partner violence, this study also done by Dr. Abigail Hatcher, this one recently published in AIDS, looks at the whether the woman during pregnancy had experienced intimate partner violence at baseline compared to those who did not. And you see increases in viral suppression during pregnancy and then postpartum and through the postpartum period, that there is a difference, a significant difference in the level of achieving viral suppression when you take intimate partner violence into account. There's actually, as we say, very little work that looks at these factors, but certainly an increasing amount. However, we know that there are ongoing studies, but we do not yet have evidence-based interventions that actually reduce traumatic stress, increase care engagement, and increase viral suppression, at least to the best of our knowledge. Although these are increasing, and recent studies show that depression treatment suggests increased viral suppression, and that there are other ongoing studies focused on trauma. So what is our study? I'll tell you the general design and then sort of how we got there and more details about the design. So this is our full project is up, what's called a hybrid type 1 effectiveness implementation design, where we actually have a framework for efficacy in our design, but are thinking about first steps to move towards implementation if it were to be found effective. So briefly, the study is focused on women as they initiate ART, enrolling them early in that process to either maintain or improve adherence. And the study question is looking at our experimental intervention Impact Plus, plus maintenance sessions as a part of that in comparison to a control, or what is actually really a comparison condition of problem-solving therapy, looking at participants for over a 1-year period with 4 months assessments of both behavioral, psychological, and biological outcomes. So how did we get here? Often this is a long story. In our case, we first did a study about 20 years ago, for an intervention called Living in the Face of Trauma, where we compared 15 sessions of a coping group intervention to 15 sessions of a support group intervention, and found significant reductions in unprotected sexual risk behavior, alcohol and cocaine use, as well as reductions in traumatic stress symptoms that were fully mediated by reductions in avoidant coping. So that initial work has been the foundation for a series of studies that we have done in South Africa related to mental health and HIV, coping, and trauma, which is informed in the context by thinking about sexual trauma as a syndemic and the factors that women living and experiencing complex trauma may face in what we put together for the intervention. Acknowledging, of course, the intersections of HIV, trauma and violence, substance use, and mental health. And so we first approached this intervention development through an R34 mechanism supported by NIMH, where we looked at the co-occurring epidemics of sexual trauma and HIV among women in South Africa, with the understanding that experiencing sexual trauma, as noted earlier, can lead to greater risk of HIV infection and poor health outcomes. So that if we actually address traumatic stress that's resulting from this sexual trauma, we would hope to improve care engagement that has the potential to lead to viral suppression. Given the absence, often in low resource settings and often in high resource settings, of mental health specialists, we were looking at a task sharing approach when there are insufficient or maybe very minimal mental health providers available, whether non-specialists can be trained and supervised to implement treatments, evidence-based treatments. So first, and the other purpose of this R34 was to see and determine what methods would be appropriate for this type of trial. Our first question was, could we actually integrate a screening into the clinical care? And we pilot tested that process and found we were able to integrate it through referral by ARV nurses, and women were willing to answer these questions. And unfortunately, we found very high reports of sexual trauma, over half, screeners suggesting of depression and traumatic stress, as well as very high levels, 3/4 of women reporting intimate partner violence in their lifetime. We also did extensive formative work, qualitative focus groups, individual interviews to help develop in an iterative process what became our impact intervention. For example, we took these represent 3 evidence-based treatments or theoretical foundations. This represents the cognitive theory of stress and coping. This is cognitive behavioral therapy focusing on head, hands, and heart, representing thoughts, feelings, and interpersonal relations, as well as cognitive processing therapy, represented as 3 legs of an Mbisa cooking pot of power, self-esteem, and trust, and safety, the 4th factor, as the lid. We found this to be something women felt they could relate to and use as a representation. Briefly, we conducted a pilot trial where we randomized to where everyone received at that time 3 sessions of adherence counseling before receiving ART, rather than test and treat as we have today. But we looked at 4 individual sessions plus group spread out between these 2 assessment points. We actually found some good evidence to show improvements in psychological variables like traumatic stress, motivation to adhere, active coping skills that were somewhat lost at 6 months, we think partly because of poor group attendance, which led us to an individual intervention in the full trial. Not in the publication, but looked at for funding, we looked at indicators of viral load suppression, whether there was a dried blood spot, indicator of taking the ARVs, and or a viral load in the national database close in time to our 6-month assessment. And actually we're able to show a significant difference in a combination of those indicators among the impact participants. So this supported our conceptual model for the current clinical trial, in terms of an intervention, Impact Plus, which includes booster sessions rather than group intervention sessions. If we can reduce avoidant coping and traumatic stress, our mental health outcomes would serve as the mediators for the secondary outcomes of ART adherence and retention and care for our primary outcome, leading to our primary outcome of viral suppression. Showing again our overall study design. When I move into more details on this, we are enrolling women who are initiating ART for the first time or potentially reinitiating, using this window of opportunity as a motivational period to potentially maintain or enhance ART adherence. With the comparison between the 2 interventions, Impact Plus and problem solving, with maintenance check-ins over time in the experimental condition and routine adherence follow-ups in the comparison control condition. We are conducting this study in 2 clinics in Kailicha. The inclusion criteria are women over 18, NACOSA speaking, recently initiating ART, basically from the implementation perspective, coming into the ART initiation clinic, meets the initiation status as long as it's within 4 months, a history of sexual abuse, and indicators of sexual trauma. We do the screening as noted upon referral from the ARV nurse. We ask a number of questions to determine eligibility, and if eligible and interested, they are then enrolled and baselined and then randomized, baseline with a number of psychological and behavioral variables. They're randomized to Impact Plus or problem solving. As noted, Impact Plus is 6 sessions of 1 hour over approximately 8 weeks, followed by basically a 6-month period of monthly booster sessions delivered by a trained and supervised non-specialist interventionist, where we focus on the integration of skills for coping with trauma and HIV treatment adherence, tailored as noted to the South African context. The problem solving is 3 sessions of based on the Problem Management Plus, which is recommended by the WHO for mental health treatment in low resource settings and delivered by a trained lay counselor. We chose we made the decision to compare 2 interventions primarily for ethical reasons, feeling that we must provide some type of stress management and some type of mental health intervention to those in the control condition. Thus, we do expect at immediate post to see improvements for all participants, with the expectation that over time and leading to our primary outcome of viral suppression for Impact Plus to have a stronger effect. So a little more about the intervention. There are, as I said, six sessions where we first focus on understanding the combined stress of sexual trauma and HIV from primarily a cognitive behavioral perspective, but this reflects our integration of motivational, what we know from motivational interviewing, where we use a bridge to serve as a way for the woman to achieve her goals. We work very much from a motivational and values perspective in the initial part of the intervention. We move into how to develop strategies for effective coping using the coping pebbles, which is the interactive skill development that's based on cognitive theory of stress and coping, and then move that coping with trauma also into coping with HIV disclosure and HIV care. When we focus on trauma, we do use, as I said in the adaptation, the components of cognitive processing therapy to help make that connection to coping strategies and understand the interaction of trauma and HIV. We then move more specifically to how coping with trauma and with HIV can lead to successful adherence, continued focus on skill development with reinforcement of successful adherence and coping with trauma. So these are our general themes. This is our we have a motto of start strong, stay strong, so that one moves through their adherence path and gets to their goals. And then all of these skills and motivational focus and adherence strategies are reviewed in the maintenance sessions. Problem solving is primarily a stress management, identifiable stressors that can potentially be managed with success in a short-term treatment. As noted, we felt strongly that all participants should receive some type of mental health intervention. So our outcome is viral suppression. We expect higher proportions of viral suppression in the Impact Plus intervention with secondary outcomes of ART adherence and HIV care engagement mediated by reductions in post-traumatic stress and coping. So these mental health indicators, mental health outcomes would lead to these secondary behavioral factors leading to the biological outcome of viral suppression. We're also very interested in the implementation and process evaluation of this intervention, so have extensive intervention fidelity measures and processes that include component checklists, audio tapes of sessions, close supervision to both guide the non-specialist delivery of the intervention, as well as fidelity to the intervention, and a standardized measure and act that we use to assess the more common therapeutic factors that we think are important in the training for the interventionists. There are acceptability ratings by participants with a subset of in-depth interviews. And then following the consolidated framework for implementation research, we plan to conduct a number of in-depth interviews with participants, interventionists, clinic staff, policymakers, health department staff. In anticipation, if we find this to be effective, we already are one step in to moving to scalability. So let me thank, we of course have, as I said, have a remarkable team. It's a combination of investigators at Columbia, as well as UCT led by John Joska, and a fantastic field team that ranges from interventionists, counselors, research assistants to be able to get this study conducted. We were planning to enroll in June, start enrollment in June of 2020. So we've had a number of COVID challenges, but feel like we're in momentum again for enrollment and happy to talk about any of those issues. Maybe our team is better represented by our pictures, especially since we have really done most of this study over Zoom. So just to close, thank you to both teams and especially to our field team at UCT and all of our investigators. So I look forward to talking with you more about how we developed this study, our rationale for the study design, what we hope to achieve, and our progress to date. So thanks again, much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sikkema, and we're really glad to have you present here with us. I'd like to welcome those participants that are just joining us. This is the 5th in the series of the WeMove webinars, and we're talking about gender-based violence. We just had a really good presentation by Dr. Sikkema, who will be with us and available to take your questions at the end of our presentation. So we'll move on right next to an exciting part of this webinar by having a young poet and activist, Tari Nyamayaro, who is joining us to give us her poem, Auditioning for My Funeral. I must say, Tariro, that listening to the poem earlier really led me to have goosebumps all over, and the passion with which you present it is really touching. I want to thank you so much for being available to be here with us this afternoon. Could you please give us a bit of the background and history, what made you come up with this poem, and also talk about your passion in terms of working with women and girls that face gender-based violence, as well as other key priorities for women and girls?
Hi, thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction. My name is Tari, as I'm most commonly known, and I am 19 years old, and I am a slam poet and social activist. And really the idea behind Audition Tape to My Funeral, which is the poem I'll be performing for you today, was I wrote the poem during a time where gender-based violence and femicide were at an all-time high in the country. And I think as a woman living that reality, there were so many emotions and feelings that I had about what was happening that I didn't know where to put. I mean, I remember when the Uyinene tragedy happened, it was my last year of school. I was preparing, for university next year and having this idea of what my life looked like after high school, but also having to confront the very real reality that life after high school is something that's constantly threatened by just the fact of me being a woman. I mean, Nene was only a year older than me and she was killed at school. So I had to balance being excited for going out into the world on my own and also having to confront the reality that I might not survive having to go out on my own. And so I really wanted to speak to that, because at the same time I was very aware that I wasn't the only one feeling that way. And I kind of wanted to use my voice and my work to kind of give people an idea of what does it feel like to be a girl living in South Africa? What does it feel like to be a woman having to walk outside on the street? What does it feel like to constantly be worried every time someone looks at you the wrong way on the street when you're crossing the road, or, to constantly have these dreams or visions of you being dead, and that's kind of what Audition Tape to My Funeral means and why I wrote it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So thank you so much, Tari, for that and for being the voice and putting out there some of the fears that girls and women and also men and boys do face around just safety in our society. So I'll hand it over to you. And again, thank you so much for being here with us.
I woke up today and realized I was 18 years old. Like the sun came up and I realized that I have existed on this earth for about 6,570 days. See, being a woman in this country, my life expectancy has been significantly shortened, and I realized that by the time I'm 19, I'll probably be dead or on the way to dying. So I thought it would be important for me to prepare for my funeral, to audition for the role of corpse. See, my funeral won't be like those other funerals. No, it'll be the greatest funeral there ever was. So great that they'll broadcast it across countries. I mean, the story of my death will be so Twitter worthy that you'll create hashtags that trend for 3 days. My face will be plastered across your statuses. You will call me Angel and tell me to rest in peace. I bet even the president himself will be there. Grace us with his presence. He will hold my mother's hand while she recites my eulogy. while her eyes fill with tears while she chokes. And afterwards, he will get up on that podium and give the best speech he has ever given. So perfectly written, with each word turning my life into a story to be remembered. He will tell you to remember my name, beg you to not forget me, and you will add me to the list of other names that we have had to remember since basically forever. And my body will lie in its casket. Every inch of me covered in bruises, stab wounds made so expertly that you could call it art. I will become the latest backdrop for the Gents Let's Do Better campaign. They will promise to do better, change their DPs to purple, sing protect our women till the cows come home, and I will smile from my grave, my dead lips forming a thank you. Because that's what you want, right, gents? A thank you for trying, thank you for sharing, thank you. My ghost will clap for you. A thank you for finally caring about my life now that I'm dead, or whatever, the way you cared about Riva or Naledi or Evelyn or Tehofatso or the hundreds of other women you care and we die, right? I will form a thank you while I wait for the next body to fall, to come lie next to me, to come keep me company, because I know it won't end with me when my soul leaves this earth. The first person I will see is Nene, and she will smile at me, that soft kind of smile, and Kwasa, she will take my hand and squeeze it just a little bit, just enough to remind me that I can still feel. I will be the latest addition to Heaven's special welcome committee. Practice my smile, practice my hug, ready to welcome the next girl, ready to tell her it wasn't her fault that I wore pants too, that I didn't make eye contact. I promise that I did everything they have ever told us to do since I was like 6, but still he raped me, still he beat me, still he killed me. So I will tell her it wasn't her, even if it feels like it. No, my funeral will be the best to ever be done. One for the history books, I swear. There are 294 days left before I turn 19. 294 more days of waking up with the sun, of breathing in air before a man claims he's right to my life or he's right to my body. 294 more days of being terrified to walk outside, of hugging my mother tight so when I'm gone, she remembers the feel of my arms around her, of pausing at the door to say goodbye to my dad. Half a see you later and half a goodbye forever, in case this is the last goodbye that I have. The last hug, the last kiss, the last time I get on the bus, the last time they see me as I am now, alive. I'm not sure if I'll make it this time next year, or even if I'll make it to the end of this day. See, like every other woman in this country, I'm living on borrowed time, waiting for my turn, for my big debut as victim number 1,000 and something. So here it is, the audition tape to my funeral. Was that good enough? Did I get the part, sir? Did I look victim enough? See, I was going for this murdered schoolgirl type of vibe, a closed casket type of silence, cold, like the autopsy of a dead body, cause of death, being woman and alive. Thank you.
I'm sure, Tari, that all the participants are applauding, are thanking you for your voice, thanking you for your passion, putting into reality the fears that girls, women, boys, and men do go through. I really want to thank you, Tariro, for that. And I cannot say enough to express my gratitude for having you present, not just for this webinar, but in our lives, to be available to put forward some of the fears that we face and bringing a limelight onto GBV so that action can be taken. I thank you. So on the screen there, you will see auditioning for my funeral by Tari Nyamayaro. It's available on YouTube. Please do take the time to view it on YouTube, as well as like and share it with others. Perhaps, Tari, very quickly, what has this last 1 year been like before we have Dr. Pinky come through, been like since you first, I see that Dr. Pinky's presentation is starting. All right. I was going to just have Tari, maybe in the question and answer session, we will have Tari come and tell us about this 1 year since you put this poem out there and the reaction that it has generated. So our next speaker is Pinky Mahlangu, a specialist scientist in the Gender and Health Research Unit of the South African Medical Research Center. She holds a PhD in public health from the University of Witwatersrand. Her research focuses on prevention of gender-based violence from a focus of adolescents and young women, development, adaptation, as well as evaluation of evidence-based findings around GBV and the interventions that can be used. I'd like to thank Pinky Mahlangu for being here with us this afternoon and handing over to you. Welcome, Pinky.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I will present on interventions that addresses gender-based violence in South Africa, particularly focusing on school and post-school education setting. There are two schools interventions that we have developed and tested as the Gender and Health Research Unit. The first one is SCOCO Supporting Success. Just to give a little bit of background on this intervention, we know from research that IPV is a key feature of early dating relationships, that as they start dating, adolescents start perpetrating or experiencing violence in this relationship. We also know that adolescents who witness IPV or experience family violence are most vulnerable to IPV victimization and perpetration. We also know, though, that adolescence is a critical stage to start instilling gender equitable relationship, to start talking about with the teenagers about the impact of violence, why is it wrong, why it should not be done. We also know that schools are a critical setting where you can implement interventions with adolescents successfully. With this background, our team developed and evaluated the effectiveness of SCOCO, which aimed to reduce dating and sexual violence amongst adolescent grade 8 learners. This slide is just showing some of the key individuals in the life of an adolescent, the parents, the teachers, and the friends, and that together they are critical in shaping the behavior and some of the values in an adolescent. So SCOCO is a multifaceted intervention with two key components to it: the school strengthening and the strengthening of relationships in families. So just a little bit about the school strengthening. So school strengthening intervention consists of a life orientation workbook for learners and also a series of school strengthening workshops for the teachers. The families strengthening component of the intervention is documented in a workbook where we talk about family strengthening. It involves parents and their teenagers that are taken through a series of workshops, which I will talk about later on. So just to go back on the life orientation component of the intervention, the intervention really focuses on GBV content, which teachers and learners go through over a full year period, and this is aligned to the National CAPS curriculum. There is also the learner clubs that are part of the intervention, implemented fortnightly using participatory methods, and some of the topics that are covered during learner clubs includes conflict resolution, communication skills, gender and power, relationship, coping and stress, and also creating a safe and a vibrant school environment. With the teachers, we bring them through workshops which are conducted by the SAMRC, where we talk about a number of topics around values in action, positive disciplining, behavior management, issues of bullying, issues of stress and coping, and also just adolescent development at large and some of the challenges that adolescents deal with, including gender-based violence. This is just a little bit of a summary around the strengthening of parent-teen relationships. This intervention is implemented over 4 full-day workshop sessions between grade 8 learners and their parents. So we have workshops with the parents on their own and also with the learners on their own. And in the sessions, we cover topics including communication skills, disciplining strategies, and also how to support teenagers for future success. We talk about violence against women and girls, its drivers and impacts. We also reflect on gender inequality and building gender equitable beliefs. We talk about stress and coping, and these are implemented using participatory methods and critical reflection. So after the RCT of SCOCO, our findings have showed that SCOCO is a promising evidence school-based intervention that addresses the drivers of rape and IPV amongst adolescents. It also empowers parents and teachers to support their teenagers to prevent IPV and also non-partner rape during adolescent stage. We also found that the parents who participated in the Families Arm reported improved communication, that they are now able to communicate with their teenagers. They reported knowledge of their child. They felt they gained better understanding around a life of an adolescent, and they felt empowered around supporting their teenagers and ensuring that they build more equitable gender attitudes. Amongst the boys who participated in the intervention, particularly the schools arm, they reported less childhood trauma and bullying and more equitable gender attitudes. The girls said they now have less depression. Our findings showed reduced depression and bullying. They also showed that amongst the girls, issues of sexuality talk are now, have improved. Many of them have started using condoms and even using contraceptives. So the second intervention I'll talk to is Ntombi Vimbela sexual violence intervention, which has been implemented in TVETs and universities in South Africa. A little bit of background around this intervention is that we conducted formative research and found that there is a high prevalence of sexual gender-based violence amongst this group. With that, we also learned that there's very limited interventions that address this problem, particularly in the South African setting, that most of the interventions that have been tested in campuses in the global north. Therefore, our team embarked on developing Ntombi Vimbela. We developed it working in 5 provinces in South Africa, and our intervention focuses particularly amongst first-year female students 18 years and between 18 and 30 years of age. Just a little bit about Ntombi Vimbela. The name itself, Ntombi, means girl or woman. Vimbela is about resisting or preventing sexual violence. So it is a risk reduction and resistance intervention. It is manualized. These are just the key themes that are covered in NV. You will see there in the colorful bubbles the 10 sessions of Ntombi Vimbela covering the different aspects. Most importantly that I want to highlight is the self-defense part of the intervention, where we take young women through skills around verbal and non-verbal physical resistance. Should they encounter a risky sexual assault situation, what are some of the things that they can do to remove themselves? We also talk to them around issues of sexual rights and consent, effective communication in relationships, how to build equitable relationships, and what to do to foster well-being and self-care. These are delivered by peer students in campuses. It's 10 workshops, which are 3.5 hours each. And these are delivered using participatory and critical reflection methods. So after piloting the intervention, our participants told us that they found NV content to be relevant, to be relatable and appropriate, empowering them with the very issues that they are experiencing in their campuses. They perceived NV to have empowered them with skills to assess and deal with sexual assault risk. They said that they now know, should they encounter a risky sexual situation, they know how to remove themselves using the resistance strategies that they were taught in NV. After attending NV, some said that they've changed attitudes and beliefs around gender. They've shifted some of the acceptance of rape myths and beliefs. They now believe that, some things that are right for women and right for men. They also reported improved communication skills. They said NV enhanced self-esteem and confidence to defend themselves. Really, in summary, what our findings showed is that NV empowered female students, issues of gender transformation, and that it reduces individual level risk factors for sexual violence victimization. As I close, just to highlight some of the key considerations in working with adolescents, we all know that it's important that we get ethical clearance, and it's also a challenge, particularly when you're working with the under 18 years of age. When you're working in a sensitive topic of gender-based violence, you need to observe all the ethical obligations that come with it. You need to report GBV cases. When you're conducting research, should you come across cases of GBV working with this group, it is an obligation for you to report. Importantly is, we need to make sure that the measurements that are used have been tested, cognitively tested with this group to make sure that they understand what they are meant to measure. The issue of triangulation is also important to ensure that we get accurate responses from this group. It's important that you use different methods to get the responses that you're looking for from the adolescents. The use of technology, we found it to be very key in keeping them engaged and interested. So for us, we used tablets to collect our data. We loaded our questionnaire on a tablet, and we found that many of the adolescents enjoyed using the tablets to answer the research questions that we had. So thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to answer some of your questions and just to clarify some of the things that did not come out clearly in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mfiki Mahlangu. That was a really informative session. It was great to hear about the 2 interventions that you have tried in populations within South Africa. Again, thank you to all the participants that are still here with us. We're going to move over to the next section, but before I have the panelists join us, we'll take part in another poll question. And I hope that the poll question is showing and that I do not have any challenges with it on this end. But in case I do run into technology challenges, the poll question that you should be seeing is GBV mitigating measures include A, building community awareness and support systems, B, multidisciplinary approach that includes mental health services, health screening and safety of the victim, C, legal framework that protects victims and assures timely judicial processes, and D is all of the above. So if you can start responding to the poll question, and I do hope that it's showing on your end as it's not projecting for me. Perhaps Melissa or Carrie can help me with responses to the poll question as the results come through. I'll read through the question again and trust that you're seeing it and able to answer. GBV mitigating measures include A, building community awareness and support systems, B, a multidisciplinary approach that includes mental health services, health screening and safety of the victim, C, a legal framework that protects victims and assures timely judicial processes, and D, all of the above.
Great, so I can report that the poll results are that 92% of people, so it's 48 out of 52 responders, said all of the above. And then the rest of the options had only 1 or 2 people voting for them. So I think the large consensus was all of the above.
All right, brilliant. So I think we do all agree that GBV is a very complex situation, a complex occurrence within our population, and it's multifaceted and therefore requires, pulling in different disciplines as well as sectors, be it the health sector or the judicial system, coming together to work on resolving the challenges of GBV. And with the next session, which is the panel discussion, my hope and trust is that we will be able to get into some of the weeds in terms of how to address GBV. So we'll move over to the panel discussion, and please do allow me to introduce our two panelists. We have Ndumiso Madubela, who is a program specialist for adolescent boys and young men at NACOSA. And I'm really happy to have Ndumiso here because part of the time we forget that GBV can be towards boys and men, and we concentrate on women and young girls. And our next panel discussant will be Ronel Koekemoer, who is a counseling coordinator from Rape Crisis. But to start with, and I can see Ndumiso is already here, welcome and lovely to have you. I'll hand over to Ndumiso to reflect on the topic that we have at hand, particularly in our context here in Sub-Saharan Africa, given our cultural norms, some of our socioeconomic situations, the gaps in the health system and support structures, just to get your views on GBV and how it relates to boys and young men, given our culture and social norms. Thank you so much, Ndumiso. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sikazwe. Just making sure that I get that right.
Please, just call me Zuzu. Just call me Zuzu.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Yes, I think I'd first like to acknowledge my privilege as a man, just even participating in this incredibly important and necessary webinars, especially with the the topic today. My pronouns are he, him. And yeah, and so I think I'm still just even trying to recover and just really process and take in just only the presentations, but just the poem as well that was delivered by Tari. And I think it really is a reflection of how bad the situation really is, especially in this country. We know that, of course, the rights of women and girls, as well as other vulnerable populations, as well as adolescent boys and young men, continue to be compromised by high levels of GBV in this country. And I think to an extent which even the prevalence of the issue, compounded, of course, by now the current global circumstances, which is COVID-19, has really triggered almost like a secondary pandemic with those rising rates also in femicide. And and rightly, as you say, it's a profoundly complex and multifaceted phenomenon that really does need for all of us to, come to the table and contribute to it. But I think the more, and I'm just listening to the presentations even from Dr. Pinky Mahlangu, what's becoming more and more evident and just obvious, I think, to me, is that there's an absolute need for an immediate and almost like I won't say a radical interruption to this, because it really becomes a status quo. And how many years and how many times are going to be talking about the very same issues when not much seems to be changing. Tari in her poem started and was talking around how she may or may not be the victim, but in the line of work that I'm doing, and I think even just in my close friends and family, it's almost every woman in this country has either experienced sexual violence or knows of someone that has experienced sexual violence. And of course, we know these are not aliens. It's people part and parcel part of our communities and part of our families. And so it's definitely something that's deeply entrenched in our social fabric that needs a lot of engaging and unpacking. And so I'm really excited to be engaging on this topic, and look forward to other presentations as we continue the dialogue.
Thank you so much. And I see Ronel is here and available to chat with us. Ronel, your views on the topic, especially working with your group around Rape Crisis. What are your thoughts in terms of GBV?
Thank you so much.
And also maybe talk a little bit about the work that your group does.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you to the doctors and the poet. It was very, very affecting. So Rape Crisis deals predominantly with sexual violence, so not necessarily the broader aspect of GBV, but obviously they're so interlinked. So we see sort of that side of the picture quite a lot. So I think what I really enjoyed about both the presentations today with Dr. Sikkema when she spoke about HIV and sexual trauma is I think that there has been this perception that sort of the health-based interventions around sexual violence must always be focused on forensic exams, HIV. While they are on that preventative medication. And so we're seeing that sort of landscape when they're dealing with side effects and coming to terms with a lot of that stuff. And so it is coming into our work, but it communicate with each other around this topic, because I think that what we see certainly in the counseling room is that a survivor's ability to recover or to have a good outcome is so much more likely if they have strong familial support, if they have good support structures at home. And I think that we do live in quite a conservative country where it is difficult for parents to talk to their children about sex and sexuality and dangerous people. So I'm very sort of excited by both interventions because I think it's bringing a very necessary conversation. I think that HIV and sexual violence, really do intersect on so many levels. But the one that I think is very important is we both suffer from these old-fashioned notions, where it used to be that HIV was an automatic death sentence. And now we know that that's not the case at all, and it's not true. And I think rape had a very similar stigma attached to it, where people would see rape survivors as these irrevocably damaged individuals who would never recover, never be able to live a meaningful life. And we know that that's also not true. So I was very excited by both of those, the speakers and the poem as well.
All right, thank you. Dr. Mfiki, I'm just making sure that you're here with us. We're opening up for Q&A, and I really want to thank the presenters, the panel discussants, and Tari as well. Unfortunately, Tari has pressing engagement and couldn't stay on with us, but we do appreciate that she was able to give her poem live with us instead of just having us watch it on YouTube, and really putting a face and a voice out there. So we've opened up for question and answers. I know there's been requests to have this recording and presentations being made available, and the Secretariat will do that. We all registered for it, so they'll send out a link where you can get all the recordings and slides for today. So I'm just trying to see if there are any questions in the chat box. If you have a burning question, please do raise your hand, unmute and go ahead and ask, in case I'm a little bit slow with, I see Dabifa, I'm sorry, I'm butchering names the same way my name gets butchered, but please go ahead and unmute, Nandifa.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Nandipa.
Nandipa, yep.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes, my question, a big congratulations and thank you to our speakers for the great presentations. I think the work that you're doing is so much needed, especially in the space of gender-based violence, where most interventions are just clinical and sort of deal with the psychosocial mental health issues on a very stereotyped way. My question is to Kathleen, Dr. Sikkema. I noticed that in your inclusion criteria, you only looked at the history of sexual abuse and not intimate partner violence. Was there a specific reason for that, since the incidence of IPV is much more greater than sexual abuse, but I've also noticed that your interventions speak to sexual trauma more specifically.
Yes, thank you. And let me just thank you for having me in this today. And I'm very impacted by Tari's poem and by the whole process. And I'm pleased to be a part of it. It's a very good question about the inclusion criteria. And without going into too lengthy of a response, it's somewhat a consequence of the research design. This is where we have this balance of what do we want to focus the intervention on, and what has other research focused on previously. So I think, and you are correct, which is that the inclusion is really quite broad. Any type of sexual trauma, assault, physical, emotional, so there it's quite broad, and of course that also includes physical. What it does exclude is for people that report physical violence but don't acknowledge it as sexual. So that's where, like when I showed the screening data from the pilot study, there certainly were more that reported IPV. So it is certainly could reach a broader audience if we more broadly had IPV. I think because our prior research was very focused on sexual abuse, and actually the US study was focused on childhood sexual abuse specifically, and almost all of those participants had re-victimization in adolescence and adulthood. So this study certainly is across any time in one's lifetime. But it's a very good question, and it's partly a process of, I initially proposed this study to be both. That's what I'm trying to say. And through the process of how to really target the intervention, the advice over time from the funding perspective was to, I'm just being transparent as I often try to be. So it was, I think it's a very good idea. I think that hopefully if this is effective, and I know there are other studies that are including IPV, I think that would be a question for implementation. Can it be readily adapted for IPV? And I think that it can, because the way that we present the sexual trauma experience, one can talk about it as little or as much as they want to. And what the model does in the intervention is, what do they identify now as stressful that might be related to having had that experience? So if they're currently having in a violent relationship, we certainly end up needing to get people to referrals and to shelters. And so it's not ignored by any means. It's just not technically an inclusion criteria alone.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kathleen. And I must say that we're really looking forward to the results of this intervention. And I do hear you, the tension between what the reviewers in the funding agency and what the PI or the other team that's working on the study conceptualize and think is pragmatic for their situation. There's always that tension. So really looking forward to seeing how this study pans out and what you can translate into IPV. So I have a question here in the chat from Harley Edwards, and then I think I'm going to ask Dr. Pinky and maybe you, Ndumiso, to respond to it. And he asked, given the general disempowerment and economic disempowerment, particularly in South Africa, and I just don't think it's South Africa, I think it's Sub-Saharan Africa and other low and middle income countries, won't programs and solutions keep falling unless we address those root causes of violence? So maybe to start, and then Dr. Pinky to come in and just, shed some light on that.
Yeah, and I think, Harley, you raise a very important question around that. And I think, well, let's unpack that. What are some of the root causes of violence, and how easy or how difficult or how complex would it be to sort of, have interventions or resolve those issues? We think, immediately what comes to mind is just thinking with the work that I'm doing, working with adolescent boys and young men, just in terms of what's their norm absolutely every single day, in terms of how to just even participate within the immediate context of society and what's celebrated and what's sort of like that learned behavior. And in unpacking that, and in terms of how do I perform as a man or as a contemporary man living in this country and this context, how do I perform that masculinity, and how do I show that manhood and my identity as a man and what that looks like. I think, in looking at first things like that, and then I think it's absolutely important that we take it as serious as it is, the issue of trauma. I think we're a country that really, really struggles with trauma, and in fact does not even know how to engage about it, which of course brings to issues such as mental health, and then how little that has been done, or how little we know, or at least how little studies have been done in terms of focusing on that. And that's both with boys and men, and not just adolescent girls and young women. So I'm 100% agreeing with you, Harley. It's that in trying to unpack and unearth these complexities, one of the focus areas should be in those roots, and really looking at behavioral studies, and really sort of targeting and learning specific behaviors in our populations, and in this context. But I don't know if Dr. Mahlangu wants to add to that, because I was also just interested in her presentation, and maybe as she responds to this, she could I'll compound a second question around the measurement of decreased depression. I'd really be interested in terms of how that was measured, because I think let me leave it there.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Pinky, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ndumiso. I think you've covered many of the points that I wanted to talk to, but I think Harley is raising a very important question, because gender-based violence, we can all agree, it's a very complex issue. And I like how you have started unpacking some of the drivers. Really, when you're looking at GBV, you need to look at it using a social ecological model. It's not only an individual level, factors that exposes somebody to risk of violence, but there are other factors, relational factors, structural level factors. And I think what Harley is raising here is, what about the structural factors that are not addressed? How much can our interventions go if we do not address these structural factors that drive gender-based violence? It's a very complex issue. It's something that cannot easily be done. But what I think I can say is that we cannot just sit because of that and feel disempowered, because this one will take us forever. However, we can target other areas which we can address. For example, one of the key issues that is driving gender-based violence in South Africa is inequitable gender attitude. That can be changed, that can be shifted for sure, using gender transformative interventions that are out there. So while we are working towards addressing these difficult issues, we could at least target some of the individual level relational factors at the community level, starting educating our communities. Issue of patriarchy, for example, in South Africa, that's a very big driver of gender-based violence. And really, there are things that we can do in trying to shift some of those inequitable gender attitudes that are driving the issue of gender-based violence. So that's just my quick bite to Harley's question that he has raised. I'll just hand back to you, Dr. Zuka.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mahlangu. I have 4 hands raised. I also see that Ronel's hand is up. Did you want to respond to the question, or can I have Louise come up and Pancha come up?
I did just want to respond to the question in the chat, and what Dr. Mahlangu said now as well is, I think I couldn't help but get my back up a little bit when I saw in Dr. Mahlangu's research about the self-defense intervention and the deterring, and I think the line was individual level risk factors of sexual violence victimization. And I definitely think there is a lot of space for that, for self-defense, and for we've definitely seen survivors want those skills because they want to feel like if they are in a situation like that again, they could do something. So in that sense, I imagine it's incredibly helpful. But I think that, speaking to the question is also, we're so often equipping women and girls on how to deal with, people coming to get them from jumping out of the bushes. And what we definitely know is that most survivors know their perpetrator. A lot of perpetrators are family members, or they are fellow adolescents, so it's not as simple, let me say, as being able to ward off an attacker, because there are much more complicated sort of relational dynamics at play. And I think that's what the other part of that intervention spoke to, is being able to get parents and children on the same level as well. So I couldn't help but think of that as well when speaking about these other drivers, of these deeper drivers around patriarchy and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So
sorry, Che, just through you, if I may, just on the point that Ronel,
very quick.
yeah, very briefly, just on the point that Ronel is making, I think an additional to that intervention that Dr. Mahlangu was presenting is that the need for, well, it's just as much as important it is to equip young women and girls and other vulnerable populations on, skills to defend themselves. It's equally important to engage all genders, and especially young boys and men, on how not to rape. I immediately think of an intervention known as the No Means No Worldwide campaign, which is some of the work that I'm working on as well. That really does that, and it's a behavior-based intervention that really looks at that was launched rather and just 2 years ago, that which is Empower Boys, which is a program and an evidence-based program or an intervention delivering educational sexual and gender-based violence prevention curriculum to adolescent boys and young men. So I just think, yeah, as you said, it's a complex issue and we should really attack it at all angles.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, all agree that we have to look at the causes of all this GBV and try to address them, and not necessarily just skew ourselves to looking at the victim and how to equip her with coping through these violations. So if I can have Louise Spotman, please unmute, put your camera on if possible, and ask your question. And then I'll come over to you, Yvonne.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me a chance to speak. I would raise a question of how important or will it be in the workplace for management, for colleagues to learn or to teach them how to treat a victim or a survivor, because a lot of us experience in the workplace more harm. It feels like you are assaulted over and over again because of the lack of knowledge. They don't understand the medication that makes you sick, little things that trigger you, deep depression, a lack of knowledge. How can we extend the training and the knowledge base into workplaces where management doesn't have the skills or the knowledge to assist you, and they actually make it a lot worse? So you never get to that healing phase because you're in fighting mode the whole time. That's just something I would like to Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Louise. So perhaps Kathleen and Mfiki, maybe you can come in. So she's looking at the scarcity of human resource to actually help address violence or mental health issues. So perhaps Kathleen, speaking with from your experience around having trained lay counselors, how can we get a critical mass of those up and running and providing services? And then Dr. Pinking, speaking from the perspective of the South African Medical Research Council, what things are in place perhaps to support scale up of mental health services?
Yes, thank you. I'll comment relatively briefly and then we can discuss further. I actually think, so there's a specific question about how might we train other people to provide support or potential types of evidence-based interventions that may affect other behaviors. I think the other thing I would say that strikes me, I completely agree with mobilization and empowerment to try to change norms and behavior, but I also wonder there may be aspects of structural interventions that will hit these broader social determinants and of a context of complex trauma. And I think, so this just makes me think of one of them, which is how do we, I'll come back to the clinics where we work. I think you probably wouldn't be surprised by this, but women are much more stigmatized to say they've been sexually traumatized than that they have HIV now. I mean, I think we first started with all the stigma that goes with HIV, and fortunately that is still out there, but reduced some. So it's quite interesting to us to be trying to implement something in a clinic setting that's primarily healthcare oriented. So the norms are changing there, I think is what I'm trying to say. Even asking about sexual trauma within a primary care clinic is highly unusual. probably because there isn't anyone to provide support if they say yes. So thinking about, even though our intervention is very individual based, the whole notion of screening for sexual trauma, screening for mental health, trying to train non-specialists as well as specialists for how to handle the consequences of trauma, that those are normative changes that are still community level, but they're in places where services could be provided. So whether that's the workplace, primary care clinics, or schools, I think that there is such shame and stigma involved in sexual trauma that, and in what we learned related to HIV is something like 1/3 of the women in our early studies that they felt they became HIV infected from the sexual trauma. And so the whole notion of coming to care and taking medications were constant triggers and reminders. And so I'm just using a few examples of things that we've learned that I think make suggestions about, can we get these, can we change norms of talking about sexual trauma and intimate partner violence in settings where people may go on any given day, so that there's a readiness to accept and to ask and to feel comfortable. Because I think if we don't figure out an effective way to ask or create an environment for people to talk about it in settings other than, you know, the fantastic services of a rape crisis center, where that's where you're expected to go, how do we, and by doing these types of interventions in schools, I think those are all, I think of those as structural interventions, even if they're targeting individuals. And that's a different type of norm to change, so that we can make it something that there are services available, and we have to be training non-specialists. And we have found that, you know, it takes very intensive training and very intensive supervision, which is also known from a lot of global mental health work, that we can train people, but to try to, you know, stay keep focused on the intervention. And the other thing I'll say, and then I'll close with that, we've really focused on the importance of addressing secondary trauma in the people who provide the services. So while we do very intensive training, we try to make a point, especially from the research perspective, that we have to do more for our interventionists than just train them. We have to be there to support and be prepared for either the consequences for them of listening to the narratives or the issues for the women.
Yeah, I can just imagine that must be rather stressful for the providers as well, having to sit through and listen to some of those stories and help individuals through that crisis. Dr. Mahlangu, any quick responses in terms of how do we make these services more available, because clearly the need is there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think Dr. Kathleen has covered most of the points. I think she's highlighted how intense and specialized training this requires, particularly in the workplace. And I think one of the problems or the issues that we have, or the challenge, is that we tend to take these issues to HR and make it an HR issue. And it doesn't work at all, because HR is not specialized enough to be able to deal with the issues, help employees with issues of trauma, for example, in the workplace. And that does not work at all. And some of the organization, we find that it's actually a once-off thing. During a GBV 16 days of activism, that is when issues of gender-based violence are addressed. And after that, there is nothing. And that doesn't work at all. I'm still to find an organization really that addresses this effectively. So far, I've not seen any. But what we have done in the MRC and started seeing a difference is that instead of making this an HR-led program, we have done it as the Gender and Health Research Unit, where we conduct workshops throughout the year with staff, with employees, sensitizing staff, awareness raising, but also if somebody comes through, we have a very good referral system that we used in the SAMRC, when somebody can get specialized training, a dedicated counselor that will work with them throughout and help them resolve some of the issues. So that's just from our experience. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Maybe Ndumiso, very quickly talk about some of the community activities or awareness or participation that you are engaged with to bring more awareness so that individuals can know where to access these services from.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's a lot, I mean, there are programs that, as Dr. Mahlangu was saying now, so some of the programs that I'm particularly involved in are dialogues and community and men's dialogues that we engage adolescent boys and young men, both in Clifton, well, many districts at least, but in Cape Town, Clifton and Mitchell's Plain, and in various districts in the country. But I mean, really providing spaces like that where, well, I think men can call each other out and men can really unpack and unearth some of these, I'll say, toxic norms and what it means being men and what it means participating in your society, whether healthy or unhealthy. So, but one of the real the dialogues, I'll say community dialogues and men's dialogues are really, I think, an important space that that is necessary to one and provoke dialogue and as well as to unpack some of these core issues and some of these drivers of GBV. And really, you know, we know that men listen to each other and men call each other out. But I think more than anything, of course, these programs are not a space to sort of lambast and point at men only, because as you said in the beginning, men are also victims of violence. You know, if you look at the statistics in this country now in terms of violence, largely, yes, it's, you know, often when people think of GBV, it has a face of a man. But I think I'd like to even just point out that, you know, men are also victims of violence. And so really programs such as that, we work with other interventions, which are social behavioral change interventions. There's one now called the Men as Change Agents that we're currently working on. And that's, again, I agree with the previous point that you can't have interventions or programs that are events. You know, when it's 16 days of activism and everyone gets excited and has an event, and then thereafter, you know, we forget about it. It's almost as though women aren't dying every day. You know, this should be a dialogue and conversation that is 365. And quite frankly, you know, we get tired of just having to say this over and over and over again. And it really is the responsibility of absolutely everyone to be having and providing spaces for such conversations. And they are definitely uncomfortable, but we need to better equip ourselves to unpack and dialogue in such issues for us to move in the right direction.
Thank you so much for that. Ronel, I've taken note of your comment in the chat and cognizant of it. So I please ask participants to look at the chat and take note of Ronel's feedback. I'm also cognizant of the time, so I'll pivot over to Yvonne. Please, Yvonne, unmute, put your mic if you can, and ask your question.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much. This has been a fantastic webinar. My name is Yvonne. I'm actually working with IAVI based in Nairobi. I'm the Director of Social Behavioral Research, but quite green on GBV, so this has been really insightful. I have a number of questions. I just hope we can also probably work on them on email after this call. First of all is in terms of if you've done any work that distinguishes GBV from an intimacy perspective, and looking at GBV from the perspective of the nuclear family. So whether it's between siblings or between a parent and their child, and also given social norms around how physical discipline is conducted in a lot of African cultures, how you distinguish or actually sensitize around the issue of what is GBV, you know, in that from that perspective. I'm also curious to hear from our presenters today if you've had any studies conducted around incidence of GBV. I do understand that quite a number of studies that you've worked on have been from a historical perspective. I'm just keen on the kind of modeling you'd use or the kind of design or approaches you'd use to actually monitor incidence of GBV. Then my final question, more so for the DTHF team, is if you've had a look at how GBV affects participation of potential, research participants in your programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yvonne, for all those questions. Yes, we're all doing a lot of learning. And perhaps to throw this in, Kathleen, Mfiki, hurt people. So talk around that and the extent of which childhood trauma is considered as the factor to GBV. So taking Yvonne's and some of the comments that come through the chat. I don't know, Dr. Mahlangu, do you want to go first? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Finish the chat, then I'll come back and reply.
All right, so Dr. Sikkema.
Sorry, I'll just make a couple of comments. Sorry, Pinky, you didn't want to go first? I'm sorry, I missed that.
So Pinky is just responding in the chat.
Got it. I think I'll just say two things. That I haven't looked, we have not yet looked, we need larger samples probably, to look at are there constellations of abuse histories that are, the question about have we looked at differences in perpetrator, basically, like if the violence is from a family member, from a stranger. We actually did some of that in the US study many years ago, and essentially confirmed what we know about childhood sexual abuse in particular, which is there's so many factors that influence the consequences over time, but they're different, obviously, as we alluded to earlier, when it occurs in the context of family. And I do think it's interesting to think about how the I'm always hesitant to use the word victim, but how the victim has how that affects her or him, and that. So I think we know that we know that from general sexual abuse research. So we're trying to understand in context of HIV, does it have any particular relation to those outcomes? But I also, and just to reinforce that, I was thinking exactly about how do we address, there's so much trauma that men experience, and so maybe their reaction to that is physical violence, but we have to look at what other traumas, both physical and sexual, that people experience, and what the impact is on their behavior. So I know that's a little broad an answer, but it was a lot of questions. But thank you for them.
All right, that's fine. We're running out of time, and I really want to thank the participants as well as the discussant and presenters. So perhaps I'll start with Ronel. Some last words, Ronel, and then over to Ndumiso and Kathleen, and finally end with Dr. Mahlangu.
Thank you. Yes, no, it's been a very interesting conversation. I think for me to see the public health sort of side of the GBV world. And also to speak to, I think what Louise was also saying is that, you know, so often it is a 16 days of activism, and we get these GBV task teams. And I think Dr. Mahlangu said, you know, the limitations of an HR approach, and that's true, is that these workshops need to be happening at the level of managers and, you know, at the level of big business leaders, not at the, you know, the level of colleagues only, you know. And I think it's hard to incentivize. It's very hard to incentivize that, because they think that this isn't their problem. This is an HR problem, and it's not. It's so much more widespread than that. But yes, thank you. I don't want to take too much.
Thank you, Ndumiso.
Thank you, Dr. Zuzu. And I think such dialogues are important to continue, and just not only just from a healthcare or from an academic perspective, but really because I mean we know that that's what influences policymakers, and you know, I'd be really keen and interested into how this affects policies, and hopefully gets there, and really that it's a dialogue that just doesn't happen on in just a webinar like this, but an ongoing dialogue that continues, and differently with a different audience as well. But yeah, excited to have participated and look forward to more dialogues.
Okay, Kathleen.
I'll just briefly say thank you very much. I know that science takes time, and it's always too long, but hopefully we learn in the process and have effective interventions that we can get to the field and to impact policy. And I think that's true for mental health more broadly. I mean, I know we're focused on gender-based violence, but I think that both can, focusing on both issues can help accelerate those kinds of interventions and policies. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Dr. Mahlangu.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and share our work and just to hear what other people are working on. It was really great. I've learned many lessons, and the poem was definitely very touching and moving. We can only keep going, we can only keep working on interventions, implementing interventions. It's a long journey that we're all looking at, and all the best, and hope to meet again in the future.
Okay, thank you. So I think what has come clear from this webinar is that gender-based violence is really multifaceted, wears many faces,